Hello, guys, and welcome to Study Time Anytime. So, for the preparation of NCA, the main subject for clearing the NCA exam is Constitution, and the very important part of Constitution is Constitution Act 1982. Now, we'll we'll try to study and read all the important provisions of Constitution Act 1982. Further, we will try to discuss some case laws in which are in consonance or which are related to the certain provisions that are introduced in this Constitution Act 1982. So, without waiting, let's start. First, from the Constitution Act 1982, Part 1, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms have been introduced by this Constitution Act 1982. So, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and rule of law. So, the very first time you may see that the supremacy of God and the rule of law has been mentioned in the Constitution, and it is mentioned in the very first part of the Constitution. Even the heading of this section is God or other deities. Further moving, A part of this part 1, A is the guarantee of rights and freedoms. Rights and freedoms in Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So what the first thing mentions here, that this charter of rights and freedom guarantees what rights and freedoms set out in it, but there is one limitation, that is there are some reasonable limits that are mentioned by law that are justified in a free and democratic society. These limits are as such which are not opposed to the democracy. Further, in B part you may see fundamental freedoms. Fundamental freedoms, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. So four fundamental freedoms have been mentioned here. Side by side we'll see the headings of these also. The first fundamental freedom is the freedom of religion and freedom of opinion, thought and conscience. So first A part is freedom of conscience and religion. Second is the freedom of thought, freedom of belief, opinion and expression, including the freedom of press. So freedom of press has been expressly mentioned in the provisions of fundamental freedoms and other media communications. So fundamental freedoms here provide freedom of expression, freedom of opinion and freedom of press. So these three things are included in it. Third, freedom of assembly. So assembly means a peaceful assembly without any arms. Fourth, freedom of association. It is the you have the freedom to form associations. Associations, as you all know, people get together and form an association to run a certain of businesses or some for their collective benefit or something. So there is freedom to form associations. Even people fight for their rights by making associations. So these four fundamental freedoms are provided by the Constitution. These are the fundamental freedoms. Then there comes in the C part, that is the democratic rights. Now democratic rights, as mentioned here, is every citizen of Canada. So it is only not provided to all the people living in Canada. The democratic rights are provided only to the citizens of Canada. Has the right to vote. Obviously, the democracy provides the right to vote. So, democratic rights are only for the citizens, not for every person. Like fundamental freedoms, as we have discussed above, these are applicable to everyone. These are applicable to every person, anyone who is living inside Canada, living on the land of Canada, has a right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, peaceful assembly, association. But the democratic rights are only for the citizens of Canada, and they has the right to vote in the election of the members of House of Commons or of a legislative assembly, and to be qualified for the membership therein. So they have the three rights. They have the right to vote for election of members of House of Commons and for legislative assembly, plus they have the right to be qualified to become the member of House of Commons or legislative assembly. Further, the fourth point is the term length for first chamber, that is the maximum duration of the legislative assembly. The no House of Commons and no legislative assembly shall continue for longer than 5 years. So the limit mentioned here for the legislative bodies is 5 years from the date fixed for the return of the writs at a general election of its members. So main important point to be noticed here is whether it is House of Commons or it is a legislative assembly, their term is of 5 years. Further, continuation in special circumstances. Now, if 5 years and elapsed, there are such circumstances where you cannot continue, you cannot go into election. And then what are those circumstances? So there are that in the time of real or apprehended war. It means that whether the war is going on or there is some apprehension or suspicion that war might happen. There is some invasion, there is some insurrection. A House of Commons may be continued by Parliament and a legislative assembly may be continued by this legislature beyond 5 years if such continuation is not opposed by the votes of more than one third of the members of House of Commons or the Legislative Assembly, as the case may be. So there will be voting properly to be held in the case where there is real or apprehended war, the invasion or insurrection. So in that case, the Parliament or the Legislative Assembly or the House of Commons will conduct votes. They will bring a motion that for the continuation of the Parliament or for the Legislative Assembly, and in that case voting will take place and that motion is opposed by more than one third or is opposed by one third of the total memberships of one third of the members of the house, then continuation will not happen. Fifth, here is annual sitting of the Legislative Assembly. So there shall be a sitting of Parliament and of each legislature at least once every 12 months. So annual sitting of Legislative Assembly will when happen. So there shall be sitting of Parliament and each legislature at least once every 12 months. So there is the legislative bodies or Parliament has to make annual sittings every year within 1 year. They cannot go beyond this limit. This is the limit, 12 months. These all are very important points that you are required to remind. These can be asked in any manner in the question. So you have to go through all these in your revision, and in the next video we'll discuss the case laws relating to it. This is the end of the video here. In the next part we'll continue this Constitution Act 1982 along with other law related videos. So stay tuned, like the video if you love it, comment freely if you have any question or suggestion, type thanks if you love the effort you have find something very good, subscribe the channel, share the video. Thank you very much for discussion.